Well, if there's one thing we know about the Apostle Paul, it's this, from what we learned from the book of Acts, is that Paul had the ability, not deliberately, he's just doing what he does as a minister of the gospel. But one thing he was able to do is he was able to whip up a crowd, and he whips up a frenzy. And that's what we're going to see today as we look at the last section of Acts chapter 19 and see how this riot that happens in Ephesus goes down. This isn't the first stir within a city that we see happening because of the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And we're going to look at this and see how this whole thing unfolds. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, let's just sum this up here. This thought about riots and things that we see in the book of Acts. So one thing that we can see is that Paul is a troublemaker. That's not meant to obviously to mean that he's a troublemaker in a moral sense. He's a moral man, but what's true of him is really just true of any other Christian who lives their life for Jesus Christ and for his glory and speaks the gospel for his glory. And that is that when you do those sorts of things, you're going to stir up trouble. And people will look at you perhaps as a troublemaker just because of what you believe. And, that's a harsh and brutal reality of life, but, it's something that is very real. Granted, I don't think we see riots so much. I got to be careful. I mean, I think we live in a day and age where riots could certainly happen because of our stance in Christ. I mean, just the volatility of all sorts of things in our country and what people get angry over and what people get offended over and what people speak against. I mean, I would say that our culture is a tinderbox. So the more, if the church in our country gets more and more serious about the gospel and proclaiming the gospel, I think that, you very well could see situations where it causes riots in the streets. Who knows? But whether you're talking about that or whether you're talking about some milder forms of objection, I think that, I think the one thing is clear is that the gospel and speaking the gospel and having the word proclaimed and prevail is really going to mix some things up a little bit. As we see with the Apostle Paul, this isn't just an Apostle Paul thing. This isn't something that we see because the Apostle Paul somehow was doing something wrong, and so he because of who he was and what he was doing in and of himself, that he was causing trouble and getting on people's bad side. It's not like Paul had to work on his people skills or anything like that. That's not what we're dealing with. We're just dealing with something that's a reality in any time, in any culture, is that when you proclaim Christ and when you live for the glory of God, you will get reaction of some sort from society at large. And that's just the truth. That's just the reality of this. Now, as I mentioned before, this isn't the first time we see something like this. We've seen this, for example, in chapter 16 with Paul in Philippi. Granted, much of what happened there, if you remember, and if you remember what we talked about way back when we looked at that chapter, some of it had to do with his gospel, but in large part, the thing the straw that broke the camel's back was the whole thing where Paul had driven out a demon out of a slave girl, and her masters now could not earn a profit from her fortune telling because the demon had been driven out, and so that was their springboard to go after Paul. But the thing is that you didn't just have these masters, however many there were, 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever, who came up against Paul. The whole city was in an uproar. And if you remember, when Paul is brought before the tribunal, all the city and all the towns and the whole crowd that was there started to speak against them as well. So there was a certain sense of chaos in that situation. Okay, and we've also seen the same thing in the very next chapter, in chapter 17, specifically in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, and this was something that Paul wasn't around for, but because of his teaching and because of what he was doing ministerially in Thessalonica, you had the unbelieving Jews who went to the troublemaking rabble of the city, the troublemakers, and they whipped up chaos. They whipped up a frenzy. They weren't able to get their hands on Paul, but they were able to get their hands on some of his fellow Christians there in Thessalonica, and so they bring them before the authorities there. That sort of thing. So you have that going on there. You have maybe a little bit of a sense of that in chapter 18, the previous chapter from where we are right now, in Corinth, although it doesn't really describe it necessarily as a crowded ruckus or a riot or anything like that. But you do have people who brought Paul before the authorities and saying, this is what he's doing, is it going against our law, blah, 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 blah. If you remember, Gallio was one who spoke up, as the person in charge, and said, look, this is ridiculous. I'm not listening to this because it has to do something with your law. I'm not concerned about that. Please go away. So, but all this to say is that what we're going to see here in Acts chapter 19 is not new with the Apostle Paul. If you've been with us in our study of the book of Acts up to this point, you're very aware of this fact. That it just seems that wherever Paul goes, trouble it awaits. And again, that's not a Paul problem. That's not because Paul is doing something wrong. That's not because Paul is not able to interact with people in a right way and he rubs people the wrong way. That's not what it is at all. What it is just genuine ministry of the gospel, and you have opposition to that. Now, when you have the human side, we have to understand that there's a spiritual battle going on. Okay, and this is really where I want us to hone our thinking in on, is it because remember what Paul famously says in Ephesians chapter 6 is saying that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the authorities in the evil spiritual realm. Pretty much, that's just a paraphrase. But I mean, Paul's point is that. The battle is not with what we can see and touch from the human side. What's manifest might come from human agency, but behind it all are the works of the evil spiritual realm. So we have to be constantly aware that there's a battle going on. And this is something I wish, in just speaking of this now and just thinking back to our past discussions, I wish I would have drilled this in more and more in past episodes as we've seen these different episodes crop up, because we have to understand that behind all of this there is a very intense spiritual battle going on between the forces of evil and the forces of good and righteousness on the side of Jesus Christ. Okay, and so that's what you have. So when you have somebody like Paul who's getting results, and then as a result of his results, you have other people who are making a difference for the gospel as they go out and preach the gospel and win people to Christ. If there's a battle going on, you have to understand that Satan is not going to take these sorts of things lying down. He's just not. And I know this. I do know that I've spoken of in the past, and that is that we here in the United States and in the West don't seem to get this very much. We seem to get more frustrated and angry at humanity, and we don't really seem to realize the spiritual battle behind everything. Now, that's not giving sinful humanity, a pass by any means. But the thing is that we get so miffed and mad at what we see in front of us with what happens with sinful man and their objections and their assaults against Christianity. And at the same time, what they do is that they forget that there's a evil spiritual realm behind the scenes that's operating as well as part of a spiritual battle. And as long as that spiritual battle is forgotten or ignored, the solutions that Christians nowadays come up with is just natural upon natural, flesh upon flesh, and not really understanding that since this is a spiritual war, then spiritual solutions are what we need to employ. Okay, so and that was the thing with the Apostle Paul. You don't see the Apostle Paul going about, just doing things from a natural, fleshly sort of way. He always seemed to have the spiritual in mind. And so he even says so as much. I mean, in 2 Corinthians, where he talks about the weapons of our warfare. It's not anything of the natural world. I believe I'm turning to it now. I believe it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's see, verse 3. I think for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Okay, so we have to better utilize our spiritual weapons, which I'm afraid the church in America really doesn't do all that much, because they don't really think along this spiritual line, the spiritual plane. So all that to say that when we get to where we are in Acts chapter 19, which we're going to try and finish up here, by the way, in verses 21 through 41, what we read of is another riot. There's a ruckus that goes on. And it's very interesting that you see this crop up given what we've just seen in the previous section. So if you were with us last time, you remember what we saw. What we saw was these 7 sons of Sceva who thought themselves as authentic. Why did my mind just go blank here? Exorcists. That's the word that I'm looking for. I was searching for it, and my mind's like, I know it starts with an E, and I don't know why my brain just shut off like that, but it did. Okay, they thought themselves as exorcists, and they tried to invoke the name of Jesus on this one particular demon. And the evil spirit says, Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize, but who are you? He overpowers these seven men and send them out bruised. And what results is, remember how I described this before. I think one of the motives that this particular demon had was, overpowering them and putting on this very aggressive display where he beats up these 7 men, which kind of demonstrates the strength of this demon-possessed person because of this demon inside of him. And which would thus put a sense of fear in people and saying that, if these people were doing this in the name of Jesus, and that's what happened, then the name of Jesus is a name that we don't want to associate with. So, that best to stay away from that whole movement. But as we mentioned last time, that whole thing backfires, and the opposite happens. There was fear to a certain degree, but that fear turned to extolling the name of Jesus even more. And you had people who were these believers who were burning their magical books that they used to use in their old system, and everything like that. And then what you read in verse 20 is where it says, "So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily." So what we saw last time was that evil's agenda backfired, and verse 20 was the result. Okay, that verse 20 is just a short version of another one of Luke's progress reports. Remember how I said how Luke kind of scatters these different progress reports as it relates to the gospel, the increase of disciples, the spreading of the word, and that sort of thing. And so you see that in verse 20. Verse 20 is amazing. That's awesome that you have that going on. It's awesome that the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily. Now, here's the thing. With that reality, do we expect Satan to go back into his corner and just accept defeat and say, okay, well, that's it. I guess there isn't anything else that I can do? No, the battle continues, okay? This is listen, you have to understand, this is a very hard-fought spiritual struggle that we're dealing with here. A very hard-fought struggle. And so as long as this continues on, with the word continuing to increase and that sort of things, expect another attack or a counterpunch from the evil spiritual realm at some point. May not be immediately, may not be right away. It might be right away. It doesn't. I don't. Who's to say how they strategize and coordinate their whole workings and their whole dealings here? But one thing that we have to understand is that Satan is not going to let the spread of the gospel just continue unabated. Even when you think on the most basic things of a spiritual struggle, you think about temptations, and you even might think about the temptation of Jesus. One of the things when Jesus, just in those three instances where Satan approached him in the desert, and Jesus would answer, "It is written, it is written, it is written." It said then at the end of that passage, it says that Satan left him until an opportune time. So Satan is always, his gears are always running. And, unfortunately, this is the way it's always going to be until the end of this side of eternity comes to an end. And then, and then the new heavens and the new earth, and where everything, where sin is done away with, until all of that happens at Christ's return, this whole battle is still going to continue. And the one thing that we can put our hope in is the fact that God is bigger and mightier than anything that happens in that realm, in the evil spiritual realm, which says a message to us is that we need to continually cling to Christ. We need to continually cling to Him, because He is our source. He is our strength, right? And He's the one who sees us through in this struggle. Since really the struggle is against Him. The attacks are against us because we are associated with Him, and we are the ones who are doing His work for His glory and by His strength. So we are targets because we are associated with Him, and we move according to His will. Okay, so while verse 20 in Acts chapter 19 is a wondrous thing, don't expect Satan to just sit down and permanently take a seat and not make another move. And that he's going to make another move. And that other move that we see here is in the rest of chapter 19 with this riot that happens in Ephesus. And it's very interesting just how the perspective behind this whole thing. And we'll talk about that here as we get into it. But let's first start out just come with some preliminary things that we see unfold here in verses 21 and 22. Just gives us a little bit of an idea of just what Paul's plans are as his ministry continues. And so it says here in verse 21, where we left off, it says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome." And you read about this this whole thing of this plan of going to Achaia and Macedonia, and then also going to see Rome. Actually, in the book of Romans, in chapter 15, this whole thing is laid out, and the reason for him doing this, when you read in Romans 15, and also other connecting passages such as in 1 Corinthians 16, and 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, the whole idea with that whole thing was that he wanted to collect offerings from the churches in those two provinces, to take back to Jerusalem, because it says he was going to go to Jerusalem. The reason why he was doing that was to take those offerings and give to the impoverished Christians, the impoverished Christian church there in Jerusalem. So which again is another example of just the unity that you see between Jew and Gentile believers, because in Jerusalem you have predominantly Jewish believing Christians being helped out by their Gentile brothers, significantly a significant distance away. We're talking about Jerusalem versus Achaia and Macedonia. That's a pretty far distance, but nevertheless, though, whether it's far or short, whether Jew or Gentile or whatever, you're dealing with these Gentile believers who want to help out their Jewish Christians who they see as brothers because of their commonality in Christ. And so what Paul says in chapter 15 of Romans is that he wants to go to Jerusalem to drop off the offering that would be collected from Macedonia and Achaia. Macedonia, by the way, the churches there most known that we know of, right, are the Thessalonian church and the Philippian church, right? Achaia, obviously, you have the Corinthian church. And so again, like I said, in First and Second Corinthians, you read about this whole thing where he encourages them to lay up some of their offerings for this very purpose. So that's what you have going on there. And so in chapter 15 of Romans, he says that after that's done, he wants to he hopes to make a visit to them in Rome, the Christians in Rome, and then have them send him off and help him on his way, which most likely means he hopes to get a financial gift to take passage to go to Spain. So Paul had his eyes on Spain to do some ministry work there. So again, you can read that in chapter 15, but that's what you have going on there. That's why here in verse 21 of Acts chapter 19, it talks about him doing this. And it says there that he's resolved in the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. So this was all, the Holy Spirit is behind this whole thing, for him to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem. And this is what he says. He says, it says, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And you know what? He will see Rome. He will see Rome. Maybe not in the way and the manner that he had in mind. And of course, we're going to see all of this the further we go here in the book of Acts. But he will see Rome. But it's going to be him seeing Rome in chains. That will unfold a little bit later. We'll cover that when we get there. But verse 22, it says, and having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So Paul stays put, and he sends these two helpers of his to Macedonia. These two might be the same people who Paul refers to. He doesn't name them by name, I don't believe, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, where he says, I send the brothers to you to help you get your offerings ready. Who knows? That might be referring to Timothy and Erastus. It might be referring to another two brothers that he dispatches that Luke doesn't mention here. Who knows? But Timothy and Erastus nevertheless go to Macedonia. Whether they're the same people who went to Achaia, to the Corinthian church, we're not entirely sure, but it's certainly possible. But the thing is, here Paul continues to stay in Asia for a while. And the assumption that you get is that he stays in Asia, he stays in Ephesus. And of course, with what unfolds here in Ephesus, Paul is going to be there as well in Ephesus when this whole riot goes down. And Paul has already spent quite a bit of time here. It seems like in Ephesus. So he's just going to spend some more time doing what he's doing, presumably. So now when we pick up in verse 23, let me read a good chunk of verses here. Let's look at verses 23 through 27 here. And so here's where we get into the troublesome situation that is going to arise out of this whole thing of Paul's ministry here. So in verse 23, it says, about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades, and said, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. Okay, so here's you have our I wouldn't even say the main antagonist, because really from this point on, Demetrius isn't really mentioned very much. But he's the one who brings up the matter. He is kind of the antagonist who brings up the matter. And this is something that's disturbing him with this whole thing of of what's happening in both in Ephesus and even in the whole Roman province of Achaia. So it's interesting how in verse 23 it says there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. So there's no little disturbance. In other words, there was a big disturbance. So we're going to see how that disturbance manifested itself. Okay, but there's no little disturbance. And Luke is going to describe how this happens. It starts with this man named Demetrius. And so Demetrius and these other fellow craftsmen, you have these other people who kind of stuck together, when people had these similar trades and things like that. You even saw that with the Apostle Paul. Remember when he kind of spent a lot of time with Aquila and Priscilla, who were of the same profession, of the same trade that he was in tent making or leather working, as the original language kind of has that saying. And so this Demetrius dude is going to appeal to these other craftsmen and let them in on this whole thing. Now it's just interesting that when we're talking about how this is approached and we're looking at this primarily from an economic standpoint, it's interesting that nobody else really thought of this, and that Demetrius is the one who has to stir this whole thing up to get these people to think along these lines and saying, hey, do you realize what this is going to do to our business? And Demetrius might be saying this because he might already be feeling the effects of this in his pocketbook. So what he's seeing is that the more that Paul ministers, the more that people are turning to Christ, and therefore they have no need to buy these little statuettes of Artemis. And so if they don't need them, they're not going to buy them. They're not going to buy them. There's, the supply is going to, demand is going to go down significantly. So with demand going down, I mean, that's bad for business, right? And so that's what Demetrius here is talking about here initially. It says that he made silver shrines of Artemis. Now this could be, because here's the thing: in Ephesus you had the main temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis. In the Roman world, because how you had Greek gods and Roman gods, how there's equivalencies and stuff. In the Roman god that's equivalent to that would be Diana. And the temple, the Ephesus was considered the main temple keeper of the goddess Artemis, and this temple apparently was amazing, and it's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And you had pilgrims of all sorts, not just people in Ephesus, but you had pilgrims of all sorts who came to do worship to the goddess Artemis, and particularly even with people from other parts of Asia, Asia Minor, who would go and do their worship of Artemis at this temple. And so you had these silversmiths who would sell these shrines of Artemis. Now, some people say they might not have been exact shrines of Artemis. It could have been, it could not have been, but it could also have been an image of the temple as well, because historically what we understand is that they made those things too, and I think they may have been equal in value. I mean, just as far as what they represented, but whatever it is, whether it was an image of the temple or of Artemis, I think what you had there were exact representations or little small miniature duplicates of the larger thing that you had existing in Ephesus, whether it's the temple or the statue of Artemis that resided in that temple. And so when religion to Artemis is big and it's going on, it's just a regular way of life, then people would buy these things, and so that's how these people made their money. And so that's what Demetrius, when he gathers these people of the similar trade together, it says in verse 25, he says, "Man, you know that from this business we have our wealth." So in other words, he's saying this is how we make our living. This is what we do here with these shrines. This puts food on the table. This is what puts clothes on Junior's back, right? So this is how we made our wealth here. This is our primary profession, probably our only profession. And it says in verse 26, it says, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made without hands are not gods. It's almost as if Demetrius is saying this as if, it's like, how could he say something like that? When we look at this and we think about this, we say that gods that are made with human hands aren't gods. We of course would say, well, yeah, of course. But in their mindset, in their pagan mindset, that whole thing totally made sense. And so his trouble is that, with more people turning away from Artemis and turning to Christ, their business is going to go down. Okay, so it's very interesting how this unfolds. So I'll mention this here in a couple minutes here, but again, like Demetrius says here in verse 26, not just in Ephesus but in all parts of Asia. So Ephesus was the main central hub, I guess, of where this worship took place, but it doesn't mean that Ephesus was the only place within Asia where people worshipped the goddess Artemis. It was all over Asia. And so again, people from all over Asia would come to Ephesus, just in pilgrimages or whatever, to do their worship and everything. And so even in those times, Demetrius would make, and his other craftsmen I'm pretty sure would clean up monetarily. And so that's just a wonderful thing about the gospel. The wonderful thing about the gospel, and especially when you see it here, as it's laid out here, is that with the success of the gospel brings monetary trouble to certain institutions or certain businesses where they shouldn't be making a profit, right? I would love to see that in other industries. If you even just think, you can think about all sorts of things in 21st century, where you would hope or you would wish that would be true. Where as the gospel spreads in a certain city, you see strip clubs and X-rated theaters going out of business because nobody's going there anymore because people are turning to Christ. Wouldn't that be cool? If you saw something like that. So when it talks about the word prevailing mightily, again referring back to verse 20, we're definitely seeing that here, and it's putting a very hard economic hit on the market for these shrines. And so notice though that all of this is zeroed in on Paul. Demetrius is saying Paul is the one who's responsible for this. Now listen, he is to a certain extent. Paul is the one who gets the whole thing started here. But as far as everything reaching out in Asia, remember what we talked about, because it did say that all the people of Asia were hearing the word of God. But the way that we should understand that is that as Paul taught in Ephesus, you had other people who would go out, who had been under Paul's teaching and under Paul's training, who would go out to other parts of Asia and preach the gospel. That's how people all over, all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord. That's how that happened. So really, if you really want to get technical about this, a whole bunch of other people are responsible for this too. But I think what Demetrius understands is that the starting point is with Paul, because Paul has been teaching these people in Ephesus. And so from his program and other people being sent out, you have this whole thing where both in Ephesus and in all places all throughout the province of Asia, you see people turning to Christ and turning away from those things that are not truly God's. And so in verse 27, it says, and there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. Now it's interesting because you would think that what's mentioned there in verse 27, if we're talking about people who are serious about their religion, and I'm sure there's a certain degree of seriousness that they have about their religion. I don't think that they're totally insincere, but it just seems interesting to me that what's said in verse 27 isn't the first thing that they mention. The first thing that the first problem that Demetrius brings up is that this is going to hit our pocketbook. right? This is going to affect our checkbook. Okay, isn't that interesting that that's the first thing? Instead of, the magnificence of our goddess Artemis is in danger, and we need to do something. And not only that, but it's going to affect our business. So that the mention of the business is secondary, but he mentions the business as the primary reason to be concerned. And then he says, and it's almost as if he's saying, oh, and by the way, not only this, but we're going to get a bad reputation from this, because we're the Ephesus is the temple keeper of this whole thing. And if business is going down, how is that going to make us look? And at the same time, it's going to affect the magnificence of our great God, of our great goddess Artemis. He says that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. So he's saying that even outside of Asia and other parts of the world, people recognize Artemis. Now, it's amazing. And see, this is where you get into understanding the superiority between God, the true God of the universe, and this goddess Artemis. Because Demetrius, the thing that you get from this, and what he's getting at, is that we have to do something about this. Otherwise, if we don't do something, then the magnificence of Artemis is in serious jeopardy. So here you have these humans coming to the rescue of their God. You see how backwards that is? You see how out of sorts that is? Or, where these people, you might have a picture of this in more tangible ways if you've ever been to a place where paganism is practiced and certain gods are practiced, where I've heard testimony of people who say that they've seen, worshipers of a certain god dancing around the statue that represents a god, or some sort of straw character made of straw, and they have to feed the gods. They have to put food in its mouth. You see a god that's totally dependent on the human worshipers, which you kind of think, well, then what kind of God is that really? When the God is really, in a real sense, dependent on the worshipers. And so you kind of get the same sense of this on a more intangible level here, where Demetrius is worried about the magnificence of Artemis, and if we don't do something, then she's going to be deposed and everything like that. Now, line that whole philosophy up against the true God of the Bible. There are assaults all the time, and we see assaults even here in the book of Acts all the time. Does anything of the negative that we see in the book of Acts diminish the magnificence and the glory of God in any way? No. In fact, when you see those episodes happening, we see God's glory shine forth even more when we see the victory from his followers that comes out of the whole negativity and persecution and trouble that you see unfold in the book of Acts. It's kind of along the same lines, I would say, of what Paul would even mention in places like 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where he talks about where there's death for us, the life of Jesus shines forth in us. And again, that's not an exact quote. That's kind of a paraphrase. But go and read 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Paul kind of alludes to the same thing of that. Where there's seems to be death, there's actually what shows forth and is manifest as the life of Jesus in their mortal bodies. So nothing of the negative side, whether it's an attack from men, an assault from the evil spiritual realm, or anything like that, nothing diminishes God's glory at all. No matter what happens, God's glory still stands, and it has nothing to do with us. Okay. It's not like we have to come to God's rescue and saying, hey, if we don't do something, then the glory of God is going to be diminished significantly. Yeah, right. Are you kidding me? That's not the way. That's not how it works. Definitely not. That's not how that works. And so if you just see the comparison between the God that we serve and the God that Demetrius served, and everybody in Ephesus and even all throughout Asia. Even with what Demetrius is saying, it says it's like Demetrius and all us other folk come to the rescue of our God. That's not how it works with us on the side of Christianity. We don't have to come to God's defense. We don't have to come to Christ's defense. God's glory still stands. His strength still manifests itself in all situations. He is always glorified. And so the superiority between the God of the Bible and Artemis is pretty significant there. So when we go into verse 28, now verse 28, let me read another section of verses here, verses 28 through 34. Let's read that there. So it says, when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. I just think that's amusing that was how it was. Verse 33. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So you have this whole thing where, okay, so how they think that just shouting "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians" is going to be a big help in their cause. How they think that's going to help, I don't know, but apparently they think so. So they start shouting this, and even before they started to do this for a 2-hour time span, you see here that in verse 28 that's what they start to do. They start to shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Or I should have looked this up myself, but as I understood from other resources in the Greek, it even says, it's even more along the lines of saying "Great Artemis of the Ephesians," as if they're actually appealing to Artemis herself. But whatever the case, and even if that's the case, you know what that kind of sounds like? That kind of sounds like what you read about in 1 Kings chapter 18 with Elijah and then the other priests of Baal. When the priests of Baal are crying out to their God, and they're going through all sorts of hoops to try and get their God's attention, and Elijah is taunting them and saying, maybe you need to shout louder, maybe he's asleep, or maybe he went on vacation, or something like that. You know, if that's the same case of what's going on here with Artemis. But whatever the case, here we have this whole thing where they're now enraged by this. So Demetrius has stirred the pot, and I think that his mission, what he was after, has been accomplished. And so now that this problem has been laid forth before them, they're enraged, and I don't know what they're more enraged at. I don't know if they're more enraged about how this is going to affect their business, or whether this is going to do damage to the magnificence of Artemis. Maybe there's an equal sort of thought behind all of this. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily have to be where there's a certain degree of anger for one or the other of those sorts of things, but they're enraged. Now, again, what else is new? You know, this sort of thing with the gospel and the spread of the gospel really rubs people the wrong way. And so, as it does here. So they're enraged, and they were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Verse 29 says, so the city was filled with confusion. Now notice how quickly this spreads. You know, it's just started out with these silversmiths and these other craftsmen, and they start shouting out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And now all of a sudden in verse 29, we're talking about the whole city. The whole city is in an uproar. The whole city is in confusion. And it says, and they rushed together into the theater, probably because that's where everybody could be housed at one time, in a reasonable sort of way, I guess. Dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. Now we've seen this before, and again, I'll bring back to your mind the whole thing that happened in Thessalonica, in Acts chapter 17, where Paul wasn't there on the scene, but when people wanted to get their hands on Paul, they couldn't find Paul. They grabbed Jason and some of his friends, and dragged them off to court. And I think one of the points that I made at that time was that is that you have if you have you have people who are closely associated with somebody who's very successful in their ministry, that's going to bring trouble on you as well. And even when you look back in chapter 16 of Silas, the masters of that slave girl were mad because Paul drove out the demon from the slave girl. And the question is, how did Silas get dragged into this whole thing? I mean, part of that might have been anti-Semitism or whatever, but Silas didn't do anything. But his close association with Paul obviously brought trouble on himself as well. So, and when I say close association, I'm meaning close association as it relates to ministry, as it relates to the Christian faith, that sort of thing. I don't think anybody who had a close association with Paul but was a non-believer would face the same trouble. And so here you have the same thing here with Gaius and Aristarchus, and they were traveling companions of Paul, and apparently the people knew this, and so they dragged them off to the crowd. And for what reason exactly, we're not sure. I mean, it doesn't look like that they were going to do them any harm. Nothing in the text indicates that they did them any harm. If they were going to hold an impromptu trial, it wasn't anything official or anything, because even one of the officials here later on in the text is going to say, this isn't the way that we're supposed to do things, essentially. So for whatever reason, I mean, they grabbed them and they dragged them to the theater. You have that situation there. But I'm pretty sure whatever the motive or whatever actually unfolded with them, the situation was not ideal for those two guys. And so in verse 30, you have Paul here. It says, "But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him." And I would probably be one to side with the disciples on that. Kind of thinking, dude, are you crazy? You stay back, okay? This seems so like Paul. Paul didn't seem to be one who was afraid to face accusation and face opponents when it came to them coming after him. We're going to see this in a couple of chapters. I believe it's in chapter 21, where you have a great riotous sort of uproar in Jerusalem. So much to the point that Roman guards have to protect him and everything when he's under arrest. But Paul asks for a moment to speak to the crowd, and so he's allowed time to speak to the crowd. And in a similar way, that's probably what you have here that Paul wants to do. Paul wants to go and he wants to speak to the crowd. Probably, and I'm knowing Paul, he probably wants to mention things of the gospel. Now, with as much uproar as there is, now understand that in other cases, you think specifically even with what had gone on in Philippi, even though you had the whole crowd that was against him, he was still in custody of people in authority. So it probably would not have happened where the whole crowd would have rushed him and maybe torn him limb from limb. Here and then in Thessalonica, he wasn't even around when that whole thing was going on, which was the reason why they grabbed Jason and some other people. Here, Paul is not under arrest. He's just on his own. And so he's thinking of going out in the midst of this whole crowd who's all gathered at the theater. And the theater is quite large. So, from what I understand anyway, so there's probably a great number of people there. And if he starts to, I think maybe the fear was, if he starts to present himself and to present the gospel, and there's a negative reaction, they've already gone this far, going outside of the whole realm of legality here of what they're doing. It probably wouldn't have been a big thing where people don't like what they hear, they rush at Paul and they tear him limb from limb, and that's the end of Paul. Maybe that's what some of his companions were thinking. Saying, Paul, are you nuts? Don't go out there. Now, it's not only those people who keep Paul from going out into the midst of the people to speak to them. But you read about in verse 31 these people called the Asiarchs. Now, who are these people? Because it says even some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his went to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. They were urging him. They say, do not go out there. Now, these Asiarchs were a certain type of official, groups of officials who were who were charged with, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, how to word this. I guess they were in charge of making sure that people of promoting Roman interests and really promoting the whole things having to do with emperor worship and things like that. So they were kind of people who made sure that everybody was unified under the whole Roman system and unified and on board with the whole thing of emperor worship and making sure that people were doing what they were supposed to do as it related to things like that, to things like that. So that's what they were charged with. Now, they were called Asiarchs because they operated in Asia, and you had these different groups, these different officials in other provinces as well, and they took on the name of the province that they were in. So if they were in Galatia, they'd be called Galatiarchs, or if they were in Achaia, they would be called Achaiarchs or something like that. That kind of sounds weird. Maybe it's just Achaiarchs, maybe not Achaiarchs. But you get the idea. So that's what they were tasked with. Now, what's interesting, and this gives you the extent of the influence of Paul and his ministry and just what God has been able to do. Now that we know who these Asiarchs are, it says, even some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his. Now, that's interesting. And especially when we understand that these are people who are tasked with making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do as it relates to emperor worship. But these people are friends of Paul who would not, believe me, and you and I both know, would not subscribe to this whole thing of emperor worship. Paul is all about Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. Jesus Christ, faith, and the gospel, all that sort of thing. Diametrically opposed to the whole thing of what the Asiarchs were tasked with organizing and making sure that those things were promoted. So even with that, you see that there's some sort of penetration there. Now, that's not to say, listen carefully, that's not to say that these Asiarchs were believers. I don't think that they were, but I think that that Paul had really been able to reach out with them and touch them in some way, and he had been able to interface with them where they became friends, which is an amazing thing, and that's not outside of God's ability to do either. It's certainly not outside of his ability to do. God is, you read in parts of Scripture, and I'm thinking specifically in places like Daniel, where God grants favor to one of his people towards somebody in higher authority, where God grants where that authority, just kind of listens to that person. And this may have been of a similar case here with Paul. So these Asiarchs were friends of Paul. And even it says, and even some of the Asiarchs. So it says even these people were saying, "Hey, Paul, it is so not a good idea for you to go out there." Okay, so from what we see here, Paul stays put. Paul doesn't venture out there. Both the disciples and these Asiarchs were pretty persuasive, and you say, "Paul, this is not a good idea. Stay put." Now, meanwhile, when you're looking at verse 32, it says, "Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together." And I guess when I read this originally and why I chuckled is because it reminds me of just how things work even today, even outside of the religious realm, when you have people who are maybe not rioting, but they're protesting. And you have people who are out there protesting and they're holding up signs of something or other. And sometimes you'll have a news correspondent who will go out and say, "Why are you protesting?" "Oh, we're protesting because they said this and this, and this person said this and this and this, and he's not welcome in our city, blah, blah, blah." Well, what did he say specifically? "Oh, well, he said a lot of things," or, "Oh, gosh, where do I start?" Usually when people react or respond like that, you're dealing with people who really don't know why they're out there. They're either just following the crowd or they heard somebody say something generally about a person or a situation, and so that sparked them off, and so they're out there. And then when they're asked specifics, they're like, "Oh, I don't know." That's nothing new in our world today, and especially in our culture. Our culture is really bad at this. They're terrible at this. You have people going out there marching in the streets for some political cause or objecting to some political thing, and then you go out and ask people why they're out there, and they can't give you a straight answer because they don't know themselves. They're just following with other people. You just got a lot of people who are just sheep, and they just follow other people and they start doing stuff. But that's what you have here. That's what you have here in verse 32. You have some people, they don't even know why they're out there, why they even came together. And then you have the confusion of others. You have some people shouting one thing and then other people shouting another thing, and they're just everybody's saying something different, and there's no this isn't organized. Let's just say that it's very quick. It's a very emotional response, and when it's just driven by pure emotion, you're not going to have anything that's organized or rational, and you're just seeing the case of that right here. So in verse 33, it says some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. And Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. Now, this Alexander, we read about an Alexander in Ephesus in Paul's epistle in I think it's maybe 1st and 2nd Timothy, actually. But it may not be the same person that Paul is referring to in those epistles. This is somebody. The impression that you get is that Alexander was somebody who was very outspoken against Christianity, who wanted to do Paul great harm. Here we have this Alexander person, and if this is a different person, we see some sort of different things unfolding for him. This guy Alexander is just the crowd prompted Alexander. And it says that he was a Jew, whom the Jews put forward. Now the crowd would recognize him as a Jew in verse 34, but you have Alexander put forward, and he's put out there, and he's motioning with his hand to make a defense. Now, what is this all about? Most likely, what you have going on here is you have probably Jewish people who put Alexander, another Jew, into the crowd. And the defense that he's making is him wanting to disassociate him and the rest of the Jews from this Paul fellow. And saying, just be sure not to mix all of us up with what this guy is doing. Is probably most likely what you have going on there. Because in the Jewish mind, and I could totally see how this would be the case, and we've come across this before where there's certain suspicions of anti-Semitism. If that whole thing was still a worry here in Ephesus, then you could see how the Jews would get worried about this. The unbelieving Jews we're talking about. I don't think Alexander or the people who put him forward were people who were believers. But they wanted to establish pretty clearly that we have nothing to do with what this guy Paul says or does or any of his followers. And so that's their whole motive there. But in verse 34 it says, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So they're all shouting this now. So they see that he's a Jew, and so they just drown out everything. And so from the crowd's eyes, they're probably seeing this and saying, well, the fact that you're a Jew, you don't even worship the same God as we do. So maybe you're a threat also. So, they say, oh, you're just a Jew. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. They drown them out. They don't care what Alexander has to say. And so now you have this whole thing, and they're shouting for 2 hours. My goodness. You would imagine that by the time this whole thing is all said and done, you have a lot of hoarse voices when this whole thing is done. For 2 hours, they cried out with one voice, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Now, let me read the rest of what we have here in this passage, starting in verse 35. And it says, and when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. And we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause we can give to justify this commotion. And let's see, and when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. So, by the way, just as a side note, it's very interesting because usually when we're talking about riots and stuff in times past, usually it's been from the hands of the unbelieving Jews. Here you have no unbelieving Jew provocation of all this. This is purely Gentile, purely pagan, where you have these riots that have taken place. And of course, we've kind of seen that in other places as well too. But all of that to say, there's a mixture. You see that sometimes from the Jews, but even now, even like in this case, you see it with unbelieving Gentiles. And so that should give us the understanding that resistance to the gospel is not just by one race or one people. It's a problem of all humanity. Okay, from all different circles, religious backgrounds, ethnicities, that sort of thing. But here you have, you have when everybody's shouting, it says a town clerk he now comes on the scene, and he quiets the crowd. Okay. And it says, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Not really entirely 100% sure what the sacred stone that fell from the sky is, the full complete story, but it had some sort of religious tradition to it that kind of propped up the religion in some sort of way. And so he's saying, look, as Ephesians, and people who live in the city, Ephesus is the temple keeper of all this, and everybody knows this. It's almost as if this person is saying, look, there really isn't any sort of threat. We know the greatness of Artemis, so there really isn't any reason for any of you or anybody else to cause this sort of commotion. If Artemis is great and we're the great temple keepers of anything, and everybody knows this, then really there isn't anything to worry about, I think, is the sense of what you're getting here. So he continues in verse 36. He says, seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. And I think maybe he was thinking there was some danger involved with doing anything rash, doing anything beyond what you're already doing right now, which we shouldn't be doing. Maybe he's afraid of starting to kill people and things like that. He's saying, look, since this can't be denied, don't do anything rash and let's settle down. And you see, and you read later on in the passage that his main concern is that they're going to be charged with rioting, something that they weren't supposed to be doing. You read further in verse 37, it says, For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our God. And that's a very interesting observation. Even from this person's mouth, they recognize that Paul is not sacrilegious and he didn't blaspheme their gods. And you know what? Paul didn't have to. He didn't have to do that. And I think this is one of the things that's very interesting about the Apostle Paul, and it's something that we can learn about, is that Paul was a single-minded individual. And what he was concerned with was dispatching the truth. He didn't approach things by first of all saying, okay, let me tell you why your gods are bad. And let me give you a list, blah, blah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Even when he was in Athens, he said, I see that you're very religious. You have an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. Now let me introduce you to that God that you don't know. And he starts speaking about God. He was really into speaking about the truth and laying forth the truth. He didn't necessarily, and that's not to say that it's inappropriate to speak out on things that are false or saying what is not true, but he didn't have to resort to saying anything, as they would say here, blasphemous about their God or smearing their God or anything like that. And Paul stayed away from that stuff not because he felt that the gods were worthy of respect. I just think it's just a matter of he just didn't think that it was necessary for him to do that. His concern was the gospel. His concern was introducing them to Jesus Christ. His concern was laying forth the truth and letting the Holy Spirit, in using that truth, do his work in the human heart. And obviously it was working, because it was producing great results in Ephesus and in the province of Asia, which is what caused this whole ruckus in the city of Ephesus to be produced in the first place. So he's saying, for you have brought these men here. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our God of our goddess. Now, I just mentioned that Paul wasn't like this, but notice we have to acknowledge that this isn't just a Paul thing, because it says here, it says, for you have brought these men here. Now, is Paul there? No, he's been encouraged to stay behind. That these men are Gaius and Aristarchus. So they're right along the same lines as what Paul does as well, and so they hadn't done anything to be sacrilegious or anything like that. And I would say that just like Paul, they had carried on in the same manner, and they were just concerned about the truth. So in verse 38 it says, if therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. In other words, let's do this through the normal standard channels that are laid out for us. This isn't a whole thing of mob justice. You run across some people even today who are into mob justice. Just even with, if you even think about the whole situation in the news that you've heard in the past week or so about these kids from Covington in Kentucky, which the whole thing of them being of taunting the Native Americans and everything is, by the videotape it's been debunked. But that hasn't stopped people from calling on violence against these teenagers from Kentucky. You can understand that for in the human heart. I mean, there's a sense where people want to take matters into their own hands. Now you take something like that and you look at something similar here, where there's a crowd that's already gathered, and they've already dragged two people into this, and they're looking for a third person, namely Paul. You have this town clerk saying, don't do anything rash. And with these people, they haven't even done anything negative. They haven't been sacrilegious or blasphemous or anything. If you have anything against them, you go through the proper channels. Proper channels. Mob justice is not the way it's supposed to happen. That's not how it's supposed to work. Right? So, I lost my place here. Verse 39, but if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. And then verse 40, for we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. And there wasn't anything that they could do to justify the commotion. Because again, most of the people didn't even know why they were there. And people were shouting one thing and another until, the whole thing with Alexander. And then when they learned that he was a Jew, then they all started shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So it's almost like this guy saying, yeah, that's great. Yeah, he is great. And you know this. And therefore, you should keep your mouth shut and go through the normal channels instead of getting everybody in the city in trouble. And so in verse 41, it says, and when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. And so there you have, and listen, that's the end of it. Now, here's the thing. You think about the power that's exhibited on one side and the lack of power that shows off on the other side. On the one side, you have the power of the gospel. You have the power of the Spirit. You have the power of God. You have people left and right who are turning to Christ, and people who are spreading that word to other people. And then you have all sorts of people all throughout, not only in Ephesus but in Asia, who are hearing the gospel and hearing about Christ. That's a display of the power of God at work. As His program is being spread to into other regions and other parts of Asia, and even, as we'll see, even in other parts of the world. Now you have the objection here that starts with Demetrius and ends with people shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And what sort of power was displayed in that sort of thing, with people shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians? What happened? Nothing. And actually, what ends up happening is everything just seems to fizzle, and then everything just ends. So you have these people shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. What kind of power did that was that sort of display? What sort of power was shown forth, and what sort of results did you see from that? Nothing. As opposed to the power of God through the preaching of the gospel, you see some great things. So there you see just kind of the night and day difference between the power that's exhibited there. These people who don't know God and don't know Christ, don't have the power of God, don't have the power of Christ, and when they come in opposition of him, all they can do is shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That's all they can do. And what does that do? Nothing. So take that, line it up next to what you see with the gospel. There's no comparison. The power of God is truly superior. And so that's what you have there. So I guess in another way, in maybe in a less significant way, but in some way nonetheless, you can even see this where evil's agenda backfires even here. So God, so the same thing now as I said before, God will not be stopped. Okay, God will not be stopped. He will continue on in what he does, and he will continue to use his servants to carry forth his program for his glory. Okay. Now, again, that doesn't mean that Satan is going to take another seat, and he's not going to make another move. And that's another thing that I want to remind you about, is that this is a struggle. But in these struggles, it's just good to see how God is stronger and more superior than the evil spiritual realm. And what we've seen today, I think, is has laid that forth pretty sufficiently. Okay. So we've finished chapter 19, and we're going to get started with chapter 20 in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, because what I want to do is I want to just take this opportunity just to take a break, and just maybe just kind of consider some other things, and then we'll pick up on Acts. I'm thinking maybe just take a week off from Acts and explore something else, and then pick up on chapter 20. But who knows? We might go another week with something else. I'm thinking 1 week. That's where I'm leaning towards. But have in your mind the possibility of maybe taking 2 weeks off from Acts. But when we get back into Acts and we get into chapter 20, mainly the latter part of chapter 20 is some amazing things, and I can't wait to get into that as well. I think we're going to have some good considerations and good discussions when we get to that point of the book of Acts. So we still have a lot of good things coming up in the book of Acts, and I hope that you come back and join us for that. And I hope you come back and join us next week, just as we consider some other things from Scripture. So be sure to be here for that. So we will leave it there. If you enjoy this show, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on iTunes and also on Google Play. I haven't been plugging Google Play very much, and just because I'm just so used to just saying iTunes. But either on iTunes or on Google Play, my podcast is available on those two avenues. And you can subscribe for free on either one of those avenues, iTunes or Google Play. So be sure to subscribe. Yeah, I would love to have you subscribe. I truly appreciate that. Also, you can check out Loving the Scripture on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, friends. I think it's been another good examination of the Word. At least from my perspective, I hope it's been the same for you as well. And I hope that you're blessed by it. But my name is Steve Gill, and I hope to see you right back here next time. Bye now.